Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
Merci de continuer à écouter. Thank you for continuing to listen. And hi, and welcome to episode 173 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. If you haven't listened to episode 172 yet, go back and listen. There was the mental men again. We had a lot of good conversation in regards to mentorship, among other things. And, go listen to it. We talked about the old ways of training. We've came up with a couple of ideas that for the future. I don't know if they're going to come out or not, but certainly we had that. But episode 173 will be with Abbie Westgate. Abbie Westgate is a former UK police sergeant. She served for about 6 years. She was passionate about her work, but fell seriously ill a year from stress, burnout, and trauma in both her professional and her personal life. On her road to recovery, she discovered a different approach to healing and was working on body semantics as well as the nervous system. This became her new passion. 2 years later, she walked away from her job and became a somatic breathwork practitioner. And she runs her own business. She's going to surely talk about that. And it's called Healing Blue Hearts. She has a lot of things to say about her experience in the UK as a police sergeant. So here's the interview. But first thing first, listen to this word from free.ai. Getfree.ai. Yes, you've heard me talk about it previously in other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because Getfree.ai is just a great service. Imagine being able to pay attention to your clients all the time instead of writing notes and making sure that the note's going to sound good and how are you going to write that note and things like that. Getfree.ai liberates you from making sure that you're writing what the client is saying, because it is keeping track of what you're saying and will create after the end of every session a progress note. But it goes above and beyond that. Not only does it create a progress note, it also gives you suggestions for goals, gives you even a mental status if you've asked questions around that, as well as being able to write a letter for your client to know what you talked about. So that's the great thing. It saves me time, it saves me a lot of aggravation, and it just speeds up the progress note process so well. And for $99 a month, I know that that's nothing. That's worth my time. That's worth my money. The best part of it too is that if you want to go and put in the code Steve50 when you get the service, at the checkout code is Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. And if you get a whole year, you save a whole 10% for the whole year. So again, Steve50 at checkout for getfree.ai will give you $50 off for the first month. And like I said, get a full year, get 10% off, get freed from writing notes, get freed from always scribbling while you're talking to a client, and just paying attention to your client so they win out, you win out, everybody wins. And I think that this is the greatest thing. And if you're up to a point where you got to change the treatment plan, well, the goals are generated for you. So getfree.ai, code Steve50 to save $50 on your first month. Well, hi, and welcome to episode 173. This is an exciting episode for me because Abbie Westgate, or Abbie Westgate, just want to make sure I pronounce it properly.
Abbie
is a former United Kingdom police sergeant and has shifted her world into something more interesting to me, not because it's not interesting to talk about first responder stuff, but really somatic breathwork. And she wants to share all this with us, plus more, I'm sure. And yes, for those of you who listen to this regularly, yeah, breathwork is hard. It's a TH, and it's not my first language, so please give me a break. So Abbie Westgate, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me today.
Well, I'm excited to have you on, and I know that we talked a little bit before the interview, and I wanted really this to be a conversation because you're fascinating I have a couple more people I know that are going from the first responder world to the mental health / coaching / whatever you want to call it world. And I think that's so important because you bring a unique approach. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart, because I think that sometimes therapists, they will have some of the life experience, but having that type of life experience really changes how you present things. But I feel like I'm describing you right now. So how about you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Steve. So yes, as you mentioned, I was in the police in the UK and I was in that role for 6 years, just over 6 years. And when I first joined those 6 years ago, it was my dream job and I did not see myself doing anything else. Like I had just one vision for life and I thought that was going to be it. But just before I was about to join the police, I went through the death of my mum, which was very sudden and unexpected. So it meant that when I was joining the police and starting my training, I also had this big bereavement going on in the background. And whilst it was a bit of a double-edged sword because I was starting my dream career, but it was just at a time where there was so much sadness and a lot of difficulty to manage. And then when you compare that to police training and learning to be a good police officer, that requires you to be at the top of your game and really switched on. And I also found that the culture at the time was very much kind of just get on with it. And if you can't, then maybe you're not up for the job. That's the message loud and clear that I got. So I ended up pushing those feelings of grief down and everything that was happening in my personal life to be able to survive and do well within my career. And for a long time that worked. I was very mindset driven and was getting a lot of achievements in life. And within 3 years I was promoted and I was doing really well in my career, loved it. But all that grief and trauma under the surface that I hadn't dealt with was coming out in other ways, and it was starting to really unpick like relationships, just the way I was looking after my health, until I reached this point where I hit this period of burnout and I felt like everything went wrong in life, everything just came crumbling down. And when I was at a period of burnout and when I had physically ill health, all that grief and all the trauma came up too, but there was nowhere to run and hide. So I found myself in this really difficult position. I was in a job with a lot of responsibility, but I was physically unwell and I was still going to work because I didn't want to let anyone down or show any signs of kind of weakness given the culture and the environment, and probably my own ego as well. I didn't want to seem like I was weak and that I couldn't do my job. And then underneath the surface, I had all these emotions and feelings that were intensified because of how long they'd been suppressed. So that was a real kind of crossroads moment for me. And that's kind of how I got onto the path of breathwork and, took a different life path, shall we say.
Well, we'll agree to disagree on that because I think that helping the community as a police officer or a sergeant and working in the breath work and the mental health field, there is helping others in they're the same thing in that way. So we'll agree to disagree that they're a different life path. I think it's similar. It's just a different way of dealing with it. And I'm very sorry for your loss. That's a young age to lose your mom. I'm sure that was very difficult. What I'm hearing, too, is someone who's been through therapy, because I'm listening to someone who is describing a lot of different things. So have you ever been in therapy, which is a standard question here, and finding your way through therapy?
So I've had some talking therapies, that's what we call it in the UK, maybe 3 occasions for a few sessions each. And with varying experiences of them, I think when I was younger, it wasn't so great. I had like an online phone call counselling service at work, which was something that I used at the time when I started to feel really quite physically unwell and everything was coming up for me. And I had a few sessions and that was a better experience. But overall, I haven't had like a long run of therapy.
Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's not for everyone. I get that, but I'm a big fan of it, obviously. And it's called talking therapy in the UK. So thank you for the information. I always learn something. As far as the physical health stuff, has that kind of resolved itself for you, or is it kind of like still an ongoing process?
Yeah, so as we speak now, I am in the best just physical health and mental health and spiritual health, like that 360 health. I'm just in such a good place. It took a long time to get there, mind. It wasn't an overnight. I think sometimes we can see the before and the afters, and we can really emphasize the after, like, look at where I am now, and think that we just jumped from here to here. But there was a lot of hard work that went in between those two moments. So yes, as of now, I'm really good, but I wasn't very good for a long time.
Well, I'm happy to hear that you're doing much better. And I think that you pointed out something that I like to remind people is that it's not a linear process, whether it's mental health, physical health, or anything. It's a long process. You see the finished results and everyone's like, oh, great, look, your finished result. Yeah. You know how much hell I went through, either physically or mentally, to get to where I'm at? I think it's an important thing to discuss with people.
And just to be realistic with the starting point, because I think if you can see someone achieving something or in a place that seems so out of reach, or just you don't resonate with and think that's nothing I can ever achieve, it's like, actually, sometimes we do need to see that before, just that we can have that connection and that identity between us.
I mean, sometimes the limits we set is only the ones we put in, so to speak, and it's really on us. And it's really working through that process. And I hear someone who went through a lot of repression to the point where it caused physical illness. So when I tell people you talked about that 360 health, I call it the mind-body-spirit connection. When you repress something mentally, it affects your body. And that's why you got to treat everything equally in order to get to be a better human being. But I don't know what you think of that, but that's just my view.
Well, I always think back to a quote from the founder of Somatic Experiencing, Peter Levine, and he talks about if we don't express and we repress, then we become numb, and numbness is like a living death. So to feel is to be human, essentially. So when we suppress and repress and we become numb, we're essentially just cancelling out what it means to be human. So that for me was a really big part of the journey, was reconnecting back to the body, connecting the mind back to the body so that I could experience life again.
And I agree. Levine is just a great person. I saw him live a few times. Just a genuine human being, and really like him. And I'll probably just try to note that put it in the show notes, because I really like him a lot. One of the things that also when we talk about the mind, body, spirit connection and the 360 health, you hear about a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. I'm wondering if we can talk a little more about the healing journey. And is it top-down? Is it bottom-up? Is it sideways? I mean, I really don't know. So just wanted to have your opinion on that.
So the top-down approach, and I'm sure it's like this in many places in the world, that we've placed so much emphasis on the brain, the mind, neuroscience, psychology. They have a place 100%, and this isn't about saying one's better than the other, because what I'm going to touch on is that those taken independently had caused me to become like disconnected from here down. So when I was at that point of burnout, physical health, trauma, what was really apparent for me was that I needed a bit of a different approach. And that's when I started working with the breath work, which works with the body and works on a somatic level. So the word somatic just basically means of the body. So that's things like nervous system regulation, somatic therapies, breath work. And what that does is start connecting the mind back to the body so that they can work in harmony with each other instead of being two opposing parts. And I think that's the real key part, is that it's not one or the other. It's like when you know how to use the bottom up approach with the top back down approach, that's when we become really powerful. And I know that now if I wanted to go to therapy, I would have a much better experience and get a lot more from it than when my body was speaking a different language and at a different place to where my mind was at. So the key is to use both. They're both really, really powerful entities, and it's just that connection between the two, that mind-body connection.
And so if someone, I'm just going to make it up as I go here. So when you talk about someone who maybe injures their foot, for example, and you talk a little bit about breath work and the somatic breath work, and that foot continues to feel bad for several weeks. How would you treat someone like that? How would you help them with the somatic breath work in regards to helping them with that? Because sometimes, I'm from the school that we injure stuff because of where our minds are at. But I don't know where you stand on that, and also want to get a little better idea, like an example, because I think when we think about bottom up versus top down, I think it's a great idea when two therapists are talking or two people who in this field do talk. But sometimes for someone who may be joining in for something like finding your way through therapy, they might not understand what that means. So you can use that example or any example you want. But.
Yeah, great question. So obviously someone with an injury like that, there's a physical injury, and that the best place for them is to go to the hospital, to the doctor, and get that physical injury dealt with. But with physical injury, there might come pain with that. Emotions, anger, there might be ways that their life has to change because they might be a very active person and all of a sudden they're restricted because they can't move around as they would usually. And that can cause stress, anxiety, depression. And that would be where the breath work would start to support them. It's to deal with the physical sensations of our experience. So the foot itself, I wouldn't say, come to breathwork and I'll heal your foot. Absolutely not. Please go to the hospital. Please go to your doctor. But I can help you deal with the physical sensations and how that's feeling within your life on that emotional, spiritual level, on that deeper level, and to help you to manage the stress, the tension, and the feelings that you have around that.
I agree 100%. I even I'm old school in the sense that I do believe psychosomatic stuff is true. So, for me, on a different point of view, I would say that someone who injures their feet in any way, shape, or form is that they're afraid to stand up for something they believe in, and that's why their foot hurts. And maybe more that's my top-down approach. But yeah, of course, I like that you said, go to the doctor, go to your hospital, get it checked. And all I can think of is I'm from the Canadian system too, where we have the socialized hospitals. I'm like, go to a hospital. You'll be there for 2 days, but you'll be better in a couple of days. Sorry, I had to put in that little 2 cents about socialized medicine. And I'm not saying it's better in the United States, by the way, for the record. So let's discuss a little more about somatic breath work, because I mean, I know a little bit about it, but I've never heard that. I don't know enough about that kind of togetherness. So breath work. So that means, you call up someone and say, hey, please work on my breath. What does that mean? And the somatic breath work, how would you conceptualize someone? And again, you worked with the police, so you know exactly what I'm going to say. With skeptical people who would look at you and go, that's a lot of bullshit what you just said. How would you describe it, and how would you maybe address any skepticism that people may have?
Firstly, I'll just touch on the skepticism point first before I give you kind of the touching on the definition of somatic breathwork. And I'll say that breathwork is experiential because you're working with the nervous system. So essentially, once someone has an experience of the breath work, it will speak for itself. So actually, I'm not here to I wouldn't necessarily debate somebody's skepticism. I would give them the experience and let them make their mind up. If after that it's a no from them, then at least they know that this is a no for me. And yeah, if they want to be skeptical about it, then have an experience. See if it works for you. If not, then great. You know that breathwork isn't for you. But if you then have this experience and it's positive, then great. You've just then, changed. You've had a shift in your mind and you've found something new. That's kind of how I would say with the skepticism. And I suppose in terms of the way that I would address and talk about what breathwork is, I would change the definition slightly depending on who I was with. So I also work with frontline workers, but I also work with a lot of entrepreneurs who are quite spiritual. So I would use very different languaging when I'm speaking to spiritual entrepreneurs or those from a personal development background who are very familiar with breathwork and the kind of deeper connotations with it, as opposed to somebody who I was meeting from the police or the ambulance service for the first time. But generally, this is kind of how I like to introduce somatic breathwork. So I say the word somatic just basically means of the body. And within a breathwork practice, we're using the breath to connect the mind back to the body so that they can work in harmony together again. instead of working as two opposing parts, because they're not working together, they're working kind of against each other. And there's a few benefits to this. The first is that it allows us to go in and release any stress, tension, energy, and emotions that are trapped in the body. But it also helps us to think more clearly. It helps us to rebalance our energy levels in our nervous system. So it's like pressing the reset button. And I think a lot of people can resonate with wanting to feel less stressed, wanting to feel more energy, and just having a nice reset in the body. And that's just how I would generally talk about it. And then depending on the person or the context that we're working, whether that was a one-to-one or a group session, I would then, make that a little bit more personalized to the situation. But that's generally how I like to introduce it so that people can generally relate and know what they're coming into.
And I do enjoy the answer you gave that I'm not here to clear your skepticism. Try it. If you don't like it, that doesn't work. That's fine with you. Me, I mean, maybe one day you'll get back. I mean, as a Reiki practitioner myself, it's on my wall and, working with first responders and a lot of people, they go, well, this stuff doesn't work. I'm like, all right, I don't really care. You want more information, you let me know. But eventually when they start trusting you and talking about other stuff, they go, well, again, this is my favorite quote. What's this Reiki shit? Unquote. And you can open up that stuff. And when you talk about somatic breathing, breath work, I really talk about, reconnecting to yourself. And especially with people with anxiety, it's a really good approach because they're like trying to resolve their anxiety by just talking to themselves. And I'm like, that doesn't work, actually. Therapy won't work, really. What you need to do is reconnect to something simple. And I talk about neutrality or even your breathing. But like for an example, if we did talk about anxiety, how would you help someone with somatic breath work? Let's say they say that I got a lot of anxiety. I just lost my child. I just lost my car and my partner is not happy with me or whatever. How would you kind of help them manage that anxiety through somatic breath work?
So as I was explaining before with the definition, when I was talking about the definition and when I was talking into skepticism a little, and I mentioned that breathwork is experiential. And a quote of one of my mentors is always that the nervous system is show not tell. So it's basically if someone is having an experience of anxiety, the first half of the breathwork session is actually designed to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So that's where stress, anxiety lives, and it's to actually take them into that side of the nervous system. So if there's any unexpressed emotions, like if we're having anxiety or there's something that's stressing us out in our life, but we haven't quite completed the emotional cycle, going into that sympathetic nervous system and starting to stimulate it, it's going to actually allow them to have the expression of that emotion and the release so that they can complete the emotional cycle. And when we get to that point, then that helps to tip them back into the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest part of the nervous system, so that they can come down again and switch their system off. So if there's anxiety and there's stories playing around in their mind and they've got the feelings of stress in their body, what we're doing is helping them to express and release that from the body, turning their system on fully, and then when that's complete, taking them down and showing them how to turn their system off fully. So it's that recharge that I'm talking about. It's that feeling of having that expression so that we can think more clearly, because we're going back into that side of the nervous system that lets us rest again.
And it makes perfect sense to go it that way. And thank you for the great explanation of parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system. I think a lot of people don't know about those two systems. And it really is beneficial to do that stuff so that you can reconnect the mind and body and let it be. I think that one of the things that I like about what you just said is that you're letting it express itself. You're not trying to repress it. And I think that that's one of the biggest things I got from that. Is there other things that you would say somatic breathwork can bring to other people other than learning to not suppress it, but actually express it?
I often find that people come with something in mind. At the start of the session, I also get them to focus on a one-word intention for something that they would like to receive. But I also caveat that by saying the experience that you might have might be different to what you want, but it will be what your body needs. that your body will inherently know what it needs and it knows what to release. So what comes up for you is wanting to come up to be moved through you. And I think sometimes people get that first time round, but for some people after maybe 1 or 2 sessions, then they get that. But yes, so you might come in thinking, actually, I'm really stressed. And it starts to touch on things that I call secondary emotions. So we might feel like tearful and upset. But if we start going into that in the breath work, actually underneath that, it might be anger that we need to express. So there's sometimes these secondary emotions. So we might think, I feel upset today, I'd like to release this grief or sadness. But what it might actually need to be doing is to release some anger. So it just really helps us to go into whatever it is and going into the depths of the emotion. And that might not be what we consciously, mentally come in with, because the language of the body, there's a truth to it. We don't get involved in the language of the body. It's the language of the subconscious. We come in, with our conscious mind. Breathwork works with the subconscious mind. So that's the difference.
All I can think of too is what you just said is interesting, because I talk about emotions, and anyone who has had an opportunity to watch Inside Out or Inside Out 2 talks about managing those emotions. To highly recommend those movies if anyone has have not a chance. Do you think that it plays a factor when, like you talked about your former job, and I certainly see that a lot, crying while you're at whatever scene or whatever situation you are is not acceptable, so you turn to anger. Is it getting back to that sadness and embracing those emotions? Because I think we repress a lot of emotions too.
Yeah, and what I've seen with emergency responders is that because they're used to maybe suppressing their emotions so much and being quite disconnected, that can take them a while to actually understand what emotions are coming up and allow themselves to let go. So there's still a lot of kind of defenses, and they have to really start to feel safe to let those walls down, because I don't think that they've ever had a safe space to express anger, sadness, whatever they need to express. And also they're often now going from incident to incident to incident to incident, so their nervous system's all over the place, and they're not absolutely able to relate to what emotions they're feeling, to what incidents sometimes. So inside just can feel like a bit of a jumble. So yeah, it can be a bit of a journey, start linking back. And I also find there are gender differences as well. So for females, typically they might cry in the session, and it's harder for them to express that anger. So when I was talking about those secondary emotions, what we often find, if we dig a bit deeper with some females, that actually it's anger that needs to come out. And for guys, it's the opposite. So they might express anger, but that secondary emotion might actually be tears and grief and sadness.
I'm very happy you brought up the gender differences, because that was my next thing too. I was going to ask you if you feel there's a difference between genders. So I really appreciate that. I find that even socially, I don't think that what I remind people is that we're socially taught these things. If I had to cry, by the way, during this podcast, I wouldn't hesitate 2 seconds. If it felt sad, I felt sad. I couldn't care less. And people repress those things, and it's acceptable. I'm a male, but I'm a therapist, so it's okay for me to cry. But I think social norms play a huge factor, because if you're a female, crying is okay, but not if you're working, as an emergency responder, as you said, because, what are you, weak? So I think that not only that is we embrace a lot of these social norms versus reality. And I think that with getting it back to the somatic breath work, it's really going back to you instead of like what socially is acceptable. I don't know. That's my thought.
Yeah, it's like it's that safe haven, that safe bubble to just go in, clear out whatever's there, although there's emotions and stresses like that we all carry, firstly from our work, but our lives are so busy too. And we all have so much going on. We have our own traumas and losses and challenges. And that's a lot to carry, especially, when we don't get time to sit and process. And we're not taught how to do that now. So something like breathwork is, from my personal journey and from what I'm seeing from my clients, is just a really powerful way to have that release and to express those emotions that we carry around with us.
So obviously there's a lot of health benefits to this. I think that what we need to realize is our well-being is not nobody else's responsibility but yourself. And while I'm not always a big fan of this statement, but I remind some of my clients sometimes, no one's here to save you. You got to really work on yourself, and you got to do the work, because I mean, I don't know if you've experienced that too, but even as a therapist, sometimes they're like, well, you're going to save me or you're going to fix me and all that. I'm like, I've never fixed a human being in my life. I barely can fix myself, so I can't fix other people. I can give you suggestions as to what to work on, and hopefully that'll be beneficial in the long term, but I don't fix people. So I don't know if that well-being and putting the power in ourselves is part of it too, or if you see it differently, or I just want to ask you.
I love that you've touched on that, because actually in the breathwork training, we talk about something called the fix-it mentality, where most people are just so used to looking to other people for the answers, or being told what to do and looking outside of themselves. And within that, there's almost a trust, firstly, in that person that I can't help myself, but also from a therapist and practitioner perspective, is that you're looking at them as if there's something wrong with them or broken, and then you need to fix them. And that's when you can give them the tools and the support, but essentially they're doing it themselves. Like, their body knows exactly what they need for going through the process. And it's that empowering trust of like, you know what you need to do. I'm just going to show you the way. You do it, and you create your own healing. You create your own well-being. You create your own experience. It's all in your hands. It's quite empowering, as opposed to, well, you come to me and then you're going to need to come to me every time that you feel stressed, anxious, etc. It's that person, it's putting it in their hands and trusting them to do so as well.
I like that, because even, without knowing, you actually touched base on last week's episode where we talked about the healing process and how we got to empower people and look at their positives, and, not always looking at what's wrong, but what's right. And I think that unknowingly, you've connected two podcast episodes together. So I appreciate that, because I really think the other part too is that if we only see ourselves as faulty, we will meet our expectations there. And I think that that's a big problem too, when you're not like really empowering yourself. And that's what I think you're talking about.
Yeah, I think as a culture, as a globally, we've outsourced a lot of our own emotions and our own health in the hands of other people. And I think that now it's all about just starting to reclaim those things for ourselves. Like, yes, there are some specialists and things we need to go out there for 100%, but we can also start to just be empowered within ourselves to do certain things for ourselves and reclaim those parts of ourselves to create that healing journey.
I so agree, because you talk about the breath work stuff. I remind people that we are such a divided, we're starting to see it more and more, obviously in the United States, we see it on a political level, but I mean, again, the Canadian in me follows the Canadian stuff. You see it in France right now, because, they always call us the cousins up in Quebec. So, and you see it in the UK too, with even, different prime minister being put in, and what people are leaning towards left and right, and then it becomes our identity. And I think that what I tell people is that that's because you want to give power to other people, because my belief system is not affected whether Abbie agrees with me or not. We can have a nice conversation about it, but it's not like if Abbie says, Steve, you're wrong about this, then my life ends. I think you say you outsource a lot of our emotions. I think we've outsourced our self-esteem to other people based on who we like versus who we are.
It's also, going a little bit into the depths here, if that's okay.
Yeah. This is your part. I want to, I've enjoyed our conversation so far. So go as deep as you want, because I really enjoy what you're talking about. And please go ahead.
So it just brings to mind a quote from Cooley, who states that I am not who I think I am, and I'm not who you think I am. I am who you think that I am. So it's essentially like we see ourselves like as a perception of a perception. Like we're often looking for our own identity through how we believe others perceive us. And I think that all these different healing modalities and therapies out there are really just trying to bring us back to ourselves and start to just reclaim who we are fundamentally and our own authenticity.
And the authenticity is so important. This is what I strive for, both in my podcast and in my life in general. Yeah, there's a little bit of showboating in this podcast in some ways. But ultimately, what I feel like the breath work, you talk about breath work, I talk about my spiritual life. I talk about a lot of different things. I've learned not to fake me, and being able to be myself sometimes is painful. And maybe it's not myself. Maybe it's a reaction to what the other person says. But that authenticity, I also remind myself that, I'm not going to spoil it too much, but, we're recording this a little in advance. Who I am today may not be the person once this podcast is released. And there's nothing wrong with that. But once we feel like we got to meet what people think of who we are, oh, that's who they think I am, that's what I got to be. I think it just puts you in a place where you lose your authenticity, you lose yourself, and you can't connect to your body because you're like, who the hell is this?
And I felt like that in the first responder space. I felt like I lost my authenticity because in roles where there's such that sense of belonging, you need to belong because your life depends on it in certain situations. So when you have that need to belong, like you lose your authenticity. And it took me a long time. I'm still on that path. I'm getting better with it every day, but yeah, I lost my authenticity for a very long time whilst I was in the police, and that was very painful.
It's something that I've shared, I think, on the podcast, and if I haven't, I certainly shared it with other people. When I worked in the first responder world, I was never a first responder. I am not stealing anyone's game here. But I kind of lost myself in that too, because I was in a different position. I started wanting to fit in and, the tough guy image. And this has always been that way. If you think I shaved my head, I've been like this. I had no hair when I was 15. So this is not a look. This is who I am. But the other part, the persona, became so much more important. And, I went from a strong feminist to someone who at times was not very nice. And I think at the end of the day, I think that environment does change you because you feel like you need to be accepted because you're in a shady situation. You need to know that someone is behind you to support you or to do that. And then you got to change a little bit of who you are. And I hear that from especially women in general, but I don't know what you think. But
yeah, I think that I see it a lot, but I would say there's not a lot of awareness around that. And what I found I'm in a unique position that I worked for 2 different police forces, and I had actually 2 very different experiences. So this, the things I talk about, mainly about authenticity, were in the first force I worked for, but in the second force, that was very, very different. I could be human there, and there were some really great people, and this wasn't really at play there. So it also comes to show that it is who you're surrounded by and the culture that's deeply embedded, like when you go in. It isn't just across the board. So therefore, it doesn't have to be the case.
It doesn't have to, and it's got to be something that more places accept it. But I also know that, you talk about, again, if you feel I'm putting down any type of place, I'm not. But sometimes we fit the role that we need to survive in. And I think that sometimes when you're not given an opportunity to be yourself, and I worked in a jail for a few years too, that's definitely a place where I couldn't be myself, and my humanity was fucking gone. And I don't want to, I treat people who work in the corrections field now, and it definitely is something they also acknowledge because you got to fit in order to survive, essentially. But I also think that if you have that 1 or 2 people that you can be that way, I think it changes the dynamic also. So your second place being more yourself probably helped your healing process. I'm not doing your therapy, I'm just saying, just observing here.
Yeah, well, I obviously have to say that for me, at the first force that I worked for, I didn't have the tools and skills that I have now. I came to them because of the disconnection I experienced in the first working environment. So therefore, it highlighted all my limitations through just going along with it. And when I worked in the second force, I had already, been doing the breath work. And you mentioned at the start whether I'd had therapy before. I have had coaching with a coach who's a trauma specialist, so slightly different. But yeah, so after that point, when I'd gone into the second force, that was almost like the second chance. It was the experience I always thought I would have in the police and the experience I always wanted around the people I thought I would be around. And they were a reflection of who I was at that time. But I maybe wouldn't have got there if I hadn't have had all those limitations exposed in the first force and in the first experience. And I maybe wouldn't have appreciated it as well. I would have maybe just taken that for granted.
So you're saying that experience is what we all need in order to grow?
Of course, yes.
I think that that's the other part too. We talk about somatic breathwork. I remind people about also, oh, I shouldn't have done this, or I wish I didn't go through this. And I tell people that's the worst thing you could ever do for yourself, because that is what is your experience and brought you to this point. People who work in the first responder world, the first emergency responders, as you call them, what I've always found is that there's something in their past that made them say, I want to help other people. And people always laugh at me because, no, they wanted to have a gun, or in the UK they don't, but no, they wanted to help people. That's essentially what people do in the first responder world. And going back to the breath work and all, I don't regret any of my experiences. In fact, losing my best friend at age 12 in a fire is probably what formed me the best. Do I wish my friend was here? Yeah, I could use 5 minutes of a hug with him, obviously, but it's not going to happen, right? So, but it helped me realize that I never want anyone to be alone with any struggles that they have, because blaming no one, I was alone, and I will never let anyone be alone in that.
That's really profound, and just so sorry that you went through such a big traumatic bereavement so young. Those experiences, as you say, like they do go on to shape us and form oftentimes part of our purpose in life. And you're completely right in what you say, that we are drawn to frontline work for a reason. And whether they're open and transparent about that reason or not, some people say, it was just something they fell into, or it was a family tradition to be in the police. But I actually know a lot of people, a lot of police officers who've had a really traumatic experiences growing up, and they join the police force because they want to use the experiences to help others. Or also, just to touch on, something that we were talking about even right at the start of the episode, when we were talking about the foot. Do you damage your foot because you're not able to stand up for yourself? Is it you're going into the police as some form of reenactment in terms of, am I able to protect those parts of me when I was younger that I couldn't stand up for myself at that time, but here I am, I'm feeling empowered. Maybe it's driven from fear sometimes.
I agree. And the quote, negative emotions are not negative. They're an indication of something's wrong. And I kind of remind people like, oh, I don't want anxiety. I'm like, well, you'll be dead when you have no anxiety, so that doesn't exist. Or I don't want to feel sad anymore. Well, no, it's normal to feel sad. It's not, if you lose X, Y, Z, like I lost my best friend. But of course, you're going to have some emotions. And I think that, you talk about the breath work and doing that somatic breath work. I think that what brought me to my realization of my spiritual life is just sitting with the uncomfortable feeling that I had. And I think that that's a little bit of the essence of what you were saying earlier. And I want to get it back to somatic breathwork. I tell my first responders, you felt like crap being in that scene, being in this position. Good. Feel like crap. Come in here, feel like crap. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yeah, because that's what's going to get it out of you. Because if you feel like crap or you repress it, it's going to break your foot. And I'm just making up the analogy we talked earlier, but it's going to break you somewhere else. So going back to the somatic breath work and a little bit of the stuff about negative emotions, I really think it's a good way to even work with first responders to kind of like get them to embrace that, hey, it's okay to feel that way. You want to come and cry in my office and you want to leave with a smile? That's great. But don't deny those, quote, negative emotions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that comes down to this misconception that we have that resilience is not feeling anything and being able to plow through every experience. And this is really, no, that is like the complete opposite to resilience. Is a resilient person somebody who can't feel any emotions and only has like one default emotion, and like they can't express or love anymore, or they can't actually feel anger or sadness? Or is it someone who can go into the depth of every single emotion, feel it, and be able to move past it and hold it and sit in it? And it's the switch between those two. It isn't an easy path. But I used to take the first one. I used to think, right, well, if I just push this down, I don't think about this grief, I don't know how to deal with it, I'll push it down and plow through. But it came back to bite me years down the line. It took 5+ years to deal with that grief.
And it takes a long time to get out of that mindset, as you said. I didn't feel anything. That's resiliency. I'm proud of that. And it's hard to break that because you feel good that you fought through, so to speak.
And it was a lot harder to, start being able to sit with my emotions. But once I started to learn how to regulate my emotions and my nervous system, I suppose it's maybe not the emotions we fear, it's the reactivity that we fear. Because when we have emotions and we take away the reactivity and the sensitivity and we learn to sit with them and regulate, that's when we have resilience and that's when we have authenticity. But if we, again, go back to the quote that I shared at the start, if we suppress and repress, we become numb, and that's when we're living a living death.
Well, I'm going to quote a little bit of spirituality here before we kind of like getting close to wrapping up here. But I go back to a statement, I think it's a Thich Nhat Hanh quote, what I resist persists. And I remind people of that too, like, oh no, I don't have this, I don't have that. And you're resisting it, but that's okay. But you're going to see that it's going to persist even more instead of letting it go. But that's a little bit of the breathwork stuff that we talked about too.
Yeah, for sure. It's wanting to come up and move through you because you don't want to hold on to it anymore. But almost to do that, you have to go through the lesson and you have to go through the cycle. A cycle has to end for a new one to begin.
Well, I think that you have a lot to offer with those cycles and that information. I know that you might be doing, sharing some stuff with the world in regards to those that stuff. Can you tell me more about it?
So yes, I am currently offering breathwork sessions. So I offer one-to-one experiences, which are great for those who are maybe new to breathwork or very curious or want to have a very private experience. Or that we can do that in groups as well, and it can be done online. And that's great if you have a group of friends and you want to have a breathwork session together and have an experience. Sometimes it can give us permission when other people are expressing to let go. So there's beauty in both. One, having that personal private experience, or being around other people. It's that co-regulation, shared environment, shared expression.
So, I'm just going to mention that I do a group for first responders. And, a couple of months ago, someone really shared a hard experience they went through. And then now everyone's sharing their experience and everyone's giving each other space. And, the comment I get all the time is like, oh, I feel I can let go and just be myself in here. I think that that's what it is, the group experience. I like the breathwork stuff for that because then you can have other people around you having that same experience. But I don't know, that's kind of what I heard you say.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've created like a safe container. And so people know when I'm in this space, I'm safe. And we need to actually feel safety before anything else comes. So we won't have an expression or release within breathwork until we have the safety. That is fundamental. So sometimes we just need to work on the safety element a little bit longer. But once it's there, once you've got that trust, that's when you can relax and let go. It's fundamental.
Well, how are we going to reach you if we want one-on-one sessions or even video sessions? And by the way, I'm going to say it right now. I'm talking to my first responders who always report listening to this podcast. Look, someone who's been there, done that, has a few T-shirts, can really, really help you. So I want to make sure that you heard me say that. So how do people reach you, Abbie?
So at present, I am on Instagram. My Instagram is healing_blue_hearts. So it's healing blue hearts. There is a link within my bio in there, which will take you through to book an online session. However, you can reach out to me via DM, because if you're a first responder, I will give you a special offer on the price of a breathwork session.
Well, I appreciate that. Not being a first responder, but working with many of them for several years, I thank you for that offer. It is well needed. So I'm making sure I'm going to put that in the show notes. Healing Blue Hearts. Make sure to DM you or click on the link in there for it to reach you. Anything else you would like to add?
I think we have gone in all corners of all things healing and frontline work and breath work today. So thank you very much for that. It's been a really interesting conversation.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. I appreciate the service that you did for the community. More importantly, I really appreciate the service you're doing right now with the breath work and the somatic breath work, because I think that's something that is not well understood and is absolutely needed. So thank you for that too.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And likewise for your work, supporting those on the front line and creating safe containers.
Well, I appreciate that, and I will talk to you soon, hopefully. Well, this concludes episode 173. Abbie Westgate, thank you so much. This was a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it, because I certainly did. But episode 174 will be with something a little different. We talk a lot about first responder stuff here, but here's someone who's going to tell us how to work. I read her book. It's amazing. Stephanie Cohen. And she's going to talk about how to overcome her fear of dogs. And I hope you join us then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.